Okay, quick safety quiz. You're on an airplane traveling with a small child next to you. And there is what they call a sudden change in cabin pressure, and the panel above you opens and the oxygen masks drop down. What is the first thing you do? That's right. You reach up, grab the mask, pull it towards you until the tube is fully extended, put your own mask on. The bag may not inflate even though oxygen is flowing. But if you are traveling with a small child, take care of your own mask first before assisting others. Sounds familiar, right? Do you know why we do this? Why they tell us to do this? Because you can't put on somebody else's mask if you're unconscious. We can't help somebody if we don't help ourselves first. If we're going to be helpful to anybody else, our first task has to be self-preservation. If we get into a panic helping the kids with their masks, we're likely to pass out. And then not only are we not helping the kids, somebody has to help us. So for the good of the whole plane, and for the good of the flight attendants who have to take care of it, we take care of our own masks first. Parents have to be reminded about this at the beginning of every flight. We all really need to be reminded about this because most parents have a strong drive to protect their children even at considerable cost, considerable risk to themselves. In the event of a panicky situation like a sudden loss in cabin pressure, and I wouldn't think too much about that euphemism if I were you, or you may never get on a plane again. But in the case of a sudden loss in cabin pressure, parents are likely not to be thinking logically. They're going to be a little bit panicky and they're going to be focused on their kids. So this little pep talk at the beginning of every flight is to remind us that heroism, personal heroism, isn't necessarily the most logical thing if we're trying to help the most people, if we're trying to take care of the most people in a logical, practical way. Now, evolutionary biology, natural selection, would tend to imply that those of us whose first instinct is to put on our own mask before helping others, that we're going to be the ones that are likely to survive. Assuming, of course, that the plane doesn't crash, then we're all in a mess. But if the difference is oxygen or no oxygen, those of us who put on our own masks first are likely to survive. But in evolutionary biology, in terms of natural selection, there are all sorts of situations where animals do things that are deleterious to themselves, that hurt themselves to help others, that seem to be selfless acts. And evolutionary biologists spend a lot of time explaining how this works. One bird out of a flock may see a predator and set up the alarm call so that all the other birds can get away, but attracts attention to that one bird that made the call, and that one bird is putting itself in danger. Why would it do that? That's not going to save that bird. The evolutionary biologists are going to say no, but it's going to save that bird's genes. It's going to save the line that are among all of its close relatives there. So that's one of the reasons why we have such a strong drive to save our children. Part of it is because we love them, usually. But a lot of it the evolutionary biologists would say that a lot of that has to do with wanting to preserve our line, wanting to preserve our genes, that we actually maybe have a better chance of preserving our genes by preserving our children than even preserving ourselves. But that inclination to help gets a little bit weaker as we get people further and further out from us. People who, second cousins, it starts to waver a little bit. People who are friends, people who we have met once or twice. Then you get into people who don't seem a lot like us, that it's a little bit harder to have that natural inclination to throw ourselves on the grenade for somebody who's not like us. And then it gets really hard for people that call themselves our enemies. Or heaven help us, people that we think of as our enemies, people we think of as less than us. It's harder and harder to sacrifice ourselves for those people, and it just makes sense. Evolutionary biologists tell us it just makes sense because we want to preserve our own genetic line. But sacrificing ourselves for strangers does not make sense. It's not practical. Self-preservation isn't just selfishness. It's not just me first, everybody else out of the way. Our self is what makes us ourselves. Our soul is what makes us unique. It makes us who we are. And so if we give that up, who are we? It's almost impossible for us to think about being compassionate for somebody else without having a self to feel compassion, without having a self to be thinking about the other. If we don't have that self to help the other, how do we help? What good are we to anybody if we're gone? Sometimes you can hear a version of this kind of oxygen mask logic in discussions about church budgets and the future of the church. You'll hear somebody say, well, of course we want to help people. Of course we want to think about those beyond ourselves, but we've got to keep up the church, right? We have to make sure that the church survives. If we don't take care of our basic needs, how can we help anybody if we shut the doors? Yes, we'll take care of other people once we've made sure that we're preserved, once our own oxygen mask is on. It's just good stewardship, right? It just makes good practical sense. What Jesus is telling the disciples in this morning's gospel does not make practical sense. It's not logical. Over the last several chapters in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has been teaching and healing and feeding and challenging the authorities. And finally, the disciples are beginning to understand that something big is going on here. Something out of the ordinary is going on. And just before today's passage, Jesus has asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am? What do you think is going on here?" And Peter, getting it right for once, Peter says, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus immediately says, "Don't talk about it, don't tell anybody," and starts telling them about suffering and death and rejection, all of these things that terrify Peter, the death and suffering that is coming. Peter has just figured out who he's dealing with here. Peter has just figured out that Jesus is the Messiah. The healing and the teaching and the feeding suddenly makes sense. It all clicks. This whole thing suddenly makes sense to Peter. He suddenly realizes who this rabbi really is. He suddenly realizes what God is doing to restore the fortunes of Israel, the things that Israel has been hoping for 1,000 years. He suddenly realizes what a big deal this is, what a triumph this is going to be for Jesus and for everybody associated with him. Peter is starting to get it and feel pretty good about it, and Jesus starts in with this ridiculous stuff about suffering and rejection and death. How much sense does that make? I can kind of imagine Peter trying to reason with Jesus, trying to, they say that this gospel says that Peter took Jesus aside and was talking to him. He says, "Come on, Jesus, I understand what you're going for here, but this really isn't the time for a big heroic gesture. I mean, we've got to be practical. We've got to be logical. This is a time to think about self-preservation, about survival. I mean, look at all the good you've done already, Jesus. Look at the people you've healed. Look at the way you've taught people. Look at the way you're challenging the empire. You've already done a lot of good, and think how much more good you can do if you stick around. You're no good to anybody if you're dead, Jesus." And this thing about rising after 3 days, yeah, that sounds really good, but I don't know if we should base the whole future of the movement on that. I mean, we'll get to that later. Right now, it just doesn't make sense to be talking about that stuff. And it doesn't make sense in human terms. It doesn't make sense in earthly terms. And so Jesus says, get your mind off earthly human things, because God's logic doesn't work that way. Jesus isn't saying don't worry about earthly things. Jesus isn't saying don't worry about other human beings. Jesus isn't saying to just pretend those don't exist. He's saying that the logic that governs humanity, the logic that governs this earth, is not God's logic. God's logic is so much bigger than that. God is perfectly capable of working through situations that don't make sense, through people that don't make sense. That seems to be God's preference, in fact, is to work in ways that don't make human sense. It doesn't make sense to use an old man and an old woman in their 90s to be the parents of a multitude of nations, right? If you want to ensure the survival of that family, of that genetic line, You're going to pick a young family. You're going to pick a family with lots of kids. The evolutionary biologists tell you that's the way to ensure that this line is going to continue. If you want to choose one people to bless all of humanity, one people to choose, how much sense does it make to choose a tiny, insignificant group of desert nomads whose only relation to the outside world seems to be to get conquered about every generation by every empire that comes through? How much sense does it make to choose them to be your chosen vessel? If you want to attract followers, people to be your disciples, how much sense does it make to start talking about taking up your cross, taking up your death, being willing to die, to lay down one's life for Jesus' sake? How much sense does that make? Even from a practical standpoint, if you want to lift up the poor and the oppressed, if you want to set right these things in the world, how much sense does it make to take a poor rabbi from a small town and send him marching directly into that buzzsaw of imperial power, knowing what is going to happen to him? How much sense does that make? If you want to reconcile all of creation to God, how much sense does it make to allow that empire to torture and humiliate and kill the Son of God? And then after that, if you want to continue that work of reconciliation in the world, if you want to have hands and feet and heart and mind in the world, how much sense does it make to work through this corrupt, venal, self-centered, paranoid human institution that we call the church? How much sense does that make? How much sense does it make that God chooses to take this lump of dirt and breathe God's own Spirit into it? How much sense does it make that God chooses to love these dirt creatures so extravagantly that God would live with them and speak with them and teach them and protect them and feed them, that God would devote God's self entirely to these creatures? It doesn't make sense that God would be so set on reconciling with these creatures that God would become one of them, become one of us, that God would take on our flesh. It doesn't make sense that God would reconcile God's self to these creatures by laying down his life to save our lives. It just doesn't make sense. And for that, we thank God. Amen.